So welcome everybody to the 89th Running Online Sport Economics Seminar. Today we have Carina Steckenleiter from the University of St Gallen presenting. The administrative notices are the same as last week, essentially, deadlines, abstract deadlines coming up for conferences in Gijón and Helsinki. Do look out for those, and I'll post things in the chat again as with last week. But I don't intend to hold up Carina too long, other than to say, please do keep your microphones on mute. Please do raise a hand if you have a question for clarification for Carina. And she has about an hour to speak in, and there's plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So without any delay, Carina, please do take away your talk.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see my slides.
Yep.
Perfect. So welcome everybody, also from my side, to this talk. In the background, actually, you see the gym of the University of St Gallen. So fitting in line with the topic of today. Actually, the paper I'm presenting has the title, "Do Local Public Expenditures on Sports Facilities Affect Sports Participation in Germany?" And this is joint work with Michael Lechner from the University of St Gallen, with Tom Pawlowski from the University of Tübingen. He's actually also here today, and Ute Schütthoff also from the University of Tübingen. And so this project, or this paper, was part of a larger project. And Tim presented the other paper, I think it was 1.5 years ago or something like that, in Roses. So especially, or in particular, the data section might be familiar to some of you who have already attended his talk. So let's get started with the introduction. So there are increasing responsibilities of municipalities in terms of providing local services and infrastructure. And hence, performance evaluations of local governments have gained in importance during recent years. And actually, there's a vast literature evaluating the performance of local governments. And so within this literature, there are different strands. So there's one strand looking at the performance of local governments in general. And I wrote down a couple of papers here. And also there's another strand of literature, of course, evaluating certain public services, such as education, healthcare provision, waste management, just to name a few of them. So if we're talking about performance, actually, how do we measure performance? And there are kind of 3 primary performance measures, also called the 3 E's for any operating system. And these are economy, to minimize costs of resources, efficiency, so to get the most from available resources, and effectiveness, meet the defined objects and achieve the intended results. So, and the literature I was talking about on the last slide, really the vast majority of it focused on measuring efficiency of local governments. Although there are a couple of papers saying that given the kind of politicized milieu of local governments, that implies that the effectiveness is at least as important as economic efficiency. So kind of how do we link to that literature? So first of all, what we do, we analyze effectiveness of local sports expenditure. So we do not analyze efficiency. Second of all, there are a couple of papers saying that the earlier literature interprets its results in a causal way, although it neglected endogeneity issues in the data arising from selection bias, unobserved heterogeneity, or reverse causality. So we try to provide a credible identification strategy, and we're going to talk about it at length later on. And third of all, we analyze the effect of local public expenditures. So sports facilities, they are an important social infrastructure in communities. They might, for instance, help reduce physical inactivity, which is, I guess, I think a huge problem. It hasn't gotten any better during the last couple of years. And as such, it might play an important role for population health, social cohesion, and social integration. And there are also actually considerable amounts of money spent on providing these facilities. So for instance, in Germany, if you take German municipalities, in 2006, they spent around 4.3 billion euros. However, we know little whether local spending on sports facilities indeed impacts physical activity. So what do we do? So we build a new database of local public sports expenditures on a municipality level. So there are around 12,000 municipalities in Germany, and we develop a measure for relevant sport expenditures. Just to give you one example, so if you are from a small village and you only look at the sports expenditure of your community, you might not really capture kind of the sport infrastructure that you're using, because you might travel. And we thought a lot about how we measure relevant sports expenditure for an individual. And we merge more local data, so data from the INCA database, which provides a lot of different regional measures such as unemployment or characterizations of the municipality, how much forest you've got, how big is the area for recreation, all that sorts of things. And we also we merge weather data. So in the next step, we merge this data, which we get on the municipality level, to representative individual level data via the official municipality code. So for individual level data, we use the GSEP, so the German Socioeconomic Panel. I guess many of you might know that data set. And we merged it year by year on an annual basis, as I said, via this official municipality key. And at the end of the day, we estimate dose response function. So the dose is expenditure and the response is the activity. And you see one example for a dose response function that we estimated here. And so why did we actually do that, or why do you want to do that? So it might be that people only benefit from sports expenditures up to a certain threshold, or they might only benefit after a certain threshold is reached. So if you do not trace out the dose response function, you actually might miss that. And we use a selection on observables approach for identification. So what do we find? We do not find an effect of local public expenditures on sports facilities on the probability to practice sports. This result is robust across age groups and municipality sizes. And if the true effect is positive, it has to be small. If this result might sound puzzling to you, I'm going to talk at the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about limitations in our data we were facing, which might also give an answer why we might do not find an effect. So, and further contributions of our paper, we provide practical features of semi-parametric estimation of dose response functions. So our baseline paper is this paper by Flores, Lagunes, Gonzalez, and Neumann. It was published in the Review of Economic and Statistics in 2012. And we suggest a new procedure to deal with an assessed covariate overlap with continuous treatments. Throughout my talk, I'm not going to talk much about the technical details of this paper. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to contact me or read our paper. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on that as well. So let's get started with the data. So the regional expenditures data and the SEP. First of all, the setting. This is a slide Tim already had on this presentation 1.5 years ago. So in 2012, there were around 130,000 core sports facilities in Germany, and half of them are uncovered sports fields. Around 25% are general indoor sports facilities, around 10% indoor tennis courts, and 5% swimming pools. And on an annual basis, around 10 billion euros are spent on sports in Germany, and out of that sum of money, around 3 to 4 billion are spent for the construction and maintenance of sports facilities, and the largest share is spent by local and regional authorities. And the revenues mainly come from state transfers and property business income and value-added taxes. So our sports-related public expenditures. So we use administrative data from 2001 until 2006. Unfortunately, there were changes in the accounting standards afterwards. This is the reason why it's not possible to use data after 2006, because they became too different across different states. And we had to adjust the data for municipality mergers in this period. So I think from 2001 to 2006, there were around 700 municipality mergers, and we had to account for that. And as I said beforehand, we have around 12,000 municipalities in Germany. So our treatment variable is a net of revenue expenditures on sports facilities and swimming pools at the local level. And we so channeling from money, which is spent by regional and federal authorities, is considered in our data, so it's included. We also have data on owner-operated community enterprises. There are many communities who kind of outsourced certain kind of tasks, sports-related tasks, into this owner-operated communities. And if we wouldn't have that in our data, we actually would miss a lot of spending, especially in the area of swimming pools. And also, our sports facility expenditures were reduced by the amount spent for the construction and renovation of stadiums for the FIFA World Cup 2006. Somebody might have that question up top of his or her head, so because that's the obvious thing in that period. And since annual numbers might be noisy, we use a 5-year average of the sports expenditures we have in our data. So other regional data which we add at the lowest available level is climate information, such as average rainfall, sunshine. We also add regional characteristic from the INCA database. The INCA database provides population, socioeconomic, regional development indicators, characterizations of landscape, and so forth. So how do we compute now our individual relevant expenditures? So we take into account that individuals may travel to facilities. As I said beforehand, with the example of a person who lives in a very rural area, and if you actually only take into account the sports expenditures from his or her community, you might not really get a really good picture of the infrastructure he might have access to. So, and the key question is, so how do we account that individuals might travel? So Pawlowski and al. Found in a 2009 paper that the average maximum willingness to travel to sport is 26 minutes. They did that for the Stuttgart region. So, but also on top of that, that travel speed might depend on the population density. So you might have a different travel speed in a very rural area versus in a core city. So what we did then, we defined 3 different types. So core cities, which are around 22% of the municipalities. The key example would be Munich, Berlin, Hamburg, all of the larger cities. Then suburban areas, which are 45% of municipalities, and rural area communities, which are 33% of municipalities. So, and then the next question is, how far can you actually travel within 26 minutes, given the different travel speeds you have? So, and we calculated that based on the German mobility report, and actually we have a distance then for 11.3 kilometers for core cities, 13.4 kilometers for suburban areas, and 40.3 for rural areas. And so we exclude expenditures of neighboring municipalities. If they are within this radius, we take them into account for the calculation. So, and the weights of the neighboring municipalities are inversely proportional to distance. And the larger the own municipality is relative to its neighbors, the less weight the neighbors get. So for instance, if let's say that the closest municipality is at 8 kilometers, so then you take that into account that this might be a larger municipalities and the other ones get less weight. So, and the final result is the relevant expenditure per capita. So how does this actually look like if we put that on a map? Here, this is really just, this is a map, it's not with the GSUB, And we just plotted out our distance-weighted sport facility per capita expenditures in Germany. And what we did here, actually, we included all sports expenditures between, if they have between 0 and the 99th percentile, because if you include the outliers, it's really hard to see anything on that map. And what you can see is you have, especially you have higher expenditures in the southwestern part of Germany, which is Baden-Württemberg. But you also see there is really within state variation in the different states. So in our next step, I want to show you how kind of the aggregated community expenditures of municipalities and the GSUB look per year. So I want to point out here what you actually see, that the numbers of communities we have in our SEP sample are around 1,700. So remember, I told you we have 12,000 municipalities in Germany overall. And so the total expenditures that are included in the GSUB in the different years are around 1.6 million. And the sum of inhabitants in the sub-communities around 55 million. So, and Germany has a population about 80 million people. So this is just to give you an idea about the different municipalities we actually have in our sub-sample. And in our next step, what I actually wanted to show you is how kind of the variable looks like if we attach it to the individuals. So we have we make a comparison here. We have the raw expenditure variable, so the ones without any restrictions. This is here white. I hope you can see it. And then the green one, which is restricted to values greater than 0 and up to the 95th percentile. And throughout our analysis, we actually going to restrict the variable to the green area. And we do that because we do not want our results to be driven by outliers. So the next step, let's get to the individual level data. As I told you, it's the German socioeconomic panel. And the SEP is the most used German individual panel data, and it started in 1984. And we used the data from 2001 onwards to reduce panel attrition. And the data set is highly informative on sociodemographics. And we link the data set on an annual basis by using the official municipality key. So that means since our treatment variable is 5 years, if a person lives in Munich from 2002 until 2004 and then decides to move to Berlin for the years 2005 and 6, he actually gets assigned the expenditures from Munich for the 3 years and then from Berlin for the last 2 years. So that's kind of the logic behind the merging process we did. And as you might know, in the GSEP, there is a discrete measure of sports participation. The variable is how frequently do you do sports, and has 5 categories. So it's daily, it's 6%. At least once per week, it's 35%. At least once per month is 8%. Less than once per month, 23, and never 29. And we create a dummy variable. Sport at least monthly, and so 49% of the people did or say they do sports at least monthly. So by looking at the variable, you might already notice one of the big drawbacks of the SEP is that we do not have any information on the intensity or on the duration or the type of exercise. So we only have this very crude measure of sports participation, which is not really ideal. And I will talk about the kind of the limitation which arise from that later in my talk. So the final sample actually that we use for estimation is as I told you, we exclude outliers, which means we censor at the 95th quantile. Then we exclude Bremen, Berlin, Hamburg, and age-wise, we restrict our sample to people being 17 to 65 in 2001, and which means there are 24 to 72 in 2008. And we do our estimation by age groups, and the reason being that we expect substantial heterogeneity by age. And so if you look at our final samples, so we have 3 samples. We have the young sample where people are 17 to 30 years old, which with a sample size of 2,000. The main sample, which has 3,700 individuals in it, and the old sample with around 4,000 people. And we have approximately, depending, 1,800 communities. So we go over to the descriptive statistics, and what I want to show you here is that what you see is that actually better regional conditions positively correlate with higher expenditures, as well as better individual economic conditions positively correlate with higher expenditures. And since we have a continuous treatment variable, we kind of split our treatment variable in 3 parts. So here you see T low, T middle, and T high, and then you kind of had a look at how the variables look in these 3 different parts of our treatment variable. And what you see actually here, if you compare unemployment for the T low, T middle, and T high, as I said, is going down. What you also see, if you look at the regions, they are here. The share of the southern states is higher and the highest treatment, and the share, so it's increasing, and the share of the eastern states is going down. And as you might know, the southern states are GDP-wise the richest states in Germany. What you also see is, if you look at the variable, so which we use as our outcome later on, sports at least monthly, here actually in T low you have 48.7 and the T high is 54.8. So what I want to show you, or kind of with that statistic, is that we have confounding that we need to account for in our analysis. So this is why we now go to the next, the chapter, econometrics part. It's 2 parts. It's identification and estimation. And I want to be brief on the estimation part. And I really want to only very briefly mention that the technical details. So as I said beforehand, if you're interested in it, feel free to contact me, and I will be also available later on. So with regards to identification, as I said, so our descriptive statistics, they point to a confounding problem. And of course, there are several possible identification strategies. We could think of IV type approaches. What we do in our paper, we choose a selection on observables approach, has the conditional independence assumption, so no confounding. And we use this combined regional individual level data, which is very rich in information. Just as a reminder, the selection on observables assumption, what does it mean in our case? So conditional on the rich set of observable treatment variables, there are no unobserved factors that simultaneously influence both the local sports expenditure and sports participation. So on what might we be worried about? So possibly confounding could be individuals who like to do sports. They may select into communities with good facilities because they care about that. And actually, if they move, they might take into account communities which actually have good facilities. And also people who are who like to do sports, they may elect politicians on a local level that actually will support good sports facilities. And we need to control for factors that influence those choices. So we control for individual social demographics that jointly influence choice of activity level and election moving decisions, such as income, age, gender, education, family status, and so on. And the same for regional information. So we actually control for economic conditions, so for the unemployment average and commuter flows. So because at this prosperous communities, naturally, they have more scope to invest in sport infrastructure than their poorer counterparts. And at the same time, areas with favorable labor market conditions are attractive for well-educated people, which in turn correlates with a higher likelihood of engaging in physical activity. And what we also control for is conditions that influence the value of a facility, investment, or maintenance cost. So first of all, we control for population density, since investment and maintenance costs are on the one hand likely to be different in rural compared to more urban areas, and the rural and urban areas are also very likely to attract a different set of people. And investment and maintenance costs of sports facilities are also likely to be impacted by prevailing weather conditions. This is why we also include average rainfall over a long time period in our analysis. And finally, since the recreational value of a community might influence individual location choice, and this seems very likely that this could be correlated with individual activity preferences, and which might as well impact spending decision on the sports facilities of municipalities at the same time. We also control for proportion of recreational area per capita in our analysis. So for the identification, how does the timeline of measuring information looks like? So here's our treatment variable. We have the sports expenditure measure, which we average over this 5 years period based on the individual's place of residence in respective year. As I said beforehand, when I gave you the example, if somebody lives for a couple of years in Munich and then he moves to Berlin, he gets 3 years the sports expenditures from Munich and 2 years from Berlin. So this is kind of his individual sports expenditure measure. And we use the year of 2001 to condition on individual and regional information. So the pre-treatment variables. And we measure sports participation in 2008. So the question is why 2008 and not 2007? So there is also a sports participation variable of 2007 in the data, but it has only 4 instead of 5 categories. So this is why we kind of take the year of 2008. But in a robustness check, we also use another year as our outcome measure. But then, of course, panel attrition at one point quickly becomes a problem. So estimation. So generally, it's important to have that we have a suitable estimator, and it should satisfy several conditions. So first of all, of course, it should account for the identification strategy. So it would be, in our case, a matching type estimator. And ideally, it's also not dependent on any arbitrary functional form assumption, which would make it semi-parametric. And of course, as I told you in the beginning of my talk, it needs to account for the nature of the treatment variable. And since we have a continuous treatment framework, we estimate dose response functions using the generalized propensity score, which is an extension of the propensity score methods for the binary treatment case. And lastly, it needs to account for the computational infrastructure constraints we faced, because all the computation actually had to be performed at the SUB Research Data Center in Berlin. Hence, it was very important that our estimation procedure was computationally not too demanding, because we had these severe time constraints actually in conducting our analysis. So individuals in our sample are denoted by E from 1 to N, and we have, as you can see above here, the potential outcome, and T is the treatment. And for each unit of observation, we observe T, so that's the treatment level he or she actually received. Then X, I, the pre-treatment variables, and Y, so the outcome which responds to the obtained treatment level. And what we actually want to estimate is the average dose response function. This is written down here, which is the expected outcome at different treatment levels. So, and the key identifying assumption is that selection into the different level of treatments is weakly unconfounded given our XI. And this was shown by Hirano Imbens. I used an abbreviation here in 2004. This is also the seminal paper for continuous treatments, and dose response estimation. So if you're interested in that, it's really worth checking that paper out. And so to rephrase it, so conditional on observed pre-treatment variables, the level treatment T is independent of the potential outcome. So So this is the conditional density of the treatment given the covariates. So in the GPS, that's your individual GPS, is the conditional density at the treatment level that the person has actually received. And this is the family of random variables indexed by T. And similar to the binary propensity score, the GPS has a balancing property, which means that the level of treatment can be considered random for units within the same GPS, rather conditional on observable characteristic. And as a final kind of step, the average DRF can be identified as the following. This was also shown by Hirano Imbens in 2004. So how does this kind of play out in practice? How do we estimate that? This is very briefly on the next slide. As I said beforehand, our baseline paper is the one by Flores, Lagunes, Gonzalez, and Neumann from 2012. They proposed the estimator we used. So this is our baseline, and we used that estimator. So the estimation is a two-step procedure. In the first step, we actually had to estimate the GPS, this generalized propensity score, and this is a parametric estimation. And it's important to note that the generalized propensity score is a density. And so we estimate the conditional density of public sports expenditures given the covariates with generalized linear models. And then the balancing tests, which we do, they're important because they give us a good indication or to check for misspecification. And what we actually do then with this balancing test is we assess whether we were successful in creating groups that are comparable with respect to their characteristic, such that we don't make an apple with bananas comparison in a way. And in the second step, we estimated those response function averaging out the GPS. And for all details, they're in the paper or in the Flores et al. Paper of 2012. So what this GPS does is we use it to compare people with have different level of sports expenditures, but GPS of same value. And so it's critical to ensure that for each observation, we have our data set, that there's a comparable observation with regards to GPS, and that a comparable observation with respect to GPS can be found. And this is why the analysis then is restricted to a subsample that fulfills imposed common support conditions. So only the individuals where we have comparable observations are still in our subsample, which we use for estimation. And as I said beforehand on the last slide, it's necessary to check whether the estimated GPS balances the covariates well. And we suggest a modified approach compared to the approach which was used by Flores Lagunes. And we introduce by this approach also an additional common support step. And in a final step, we re-estimate the GPS on the remaining sample, and the overall balancing of our main specification seems to be okay. And here on the table, you can kind of you see an overview what the different steps kind of do in terms of the number of observations we have to discard. So in the first step, where you impose the common support condition, we lose 126 observations. And the second step, where we kind of use our balancing procedure, we have to discard another 23. And by re-estimating the GPS on our common support sample, we lose an additional 38 observations. So now finally, let's go to the results. How does our dose response function look like? But first of all, I want to show you briefly the summary of the estimation results of the generalized propensity score. So the first step of our estimation. So for the variables which are associated with expenditures levels, I've noted it down here: population density and education level, they're positively associated, and unemployment, outward commuting, and German nationality are negatively correlated. So now finally, our dose response function. Here's the treatment. As a reminder, the median expenditure is 24 euros. And we actually, how we estimate our dose response function, we estimated with a pointwise estimation at 99 different levels of the treatment. And actually, how do we interpret it? I think it's easier to interpret it if we do a comparison of our DRF estimates at different levels. And what I wrote down here, I make a comparison of the dose response function estimate at 20 euros expenditure and 30 euros expenditure. So at the percentile 37, so it's, as I said, it's a pointwise estimation, which corresponds to net per capita expenditures around 20 euros. The estimate for the dose response function is 0.464. And at percentile 65, which corresponds to net per capita expenditures of around roughly 30 euros, the estimate for the dose response function is 0.47, which means that if we would increase our per capita expenditures from roughly 20 to 30 euros, this would only translate into a change in at least monthly sports participation of 0.6 percentage points. And if you think about it, it's actually then pretty costly, because if you have to increase per capita expenditures for around 10 euros, and the change is actually not that large, which you gain from it. So what we also do is we estimate a treatment effect function, and what the treatment effect function is also done for our main group, it gives you the marginal effect of an additional 0.5 euro spending in per capita. So it's kind of the derivative on the probability to at least do sports monthly. And what you see here is that none of the point estimates are statistically different from 0. So throughout the dose response. Of course, what we also did, we did various robustness checks with our results. First of all, we used alternative outcomes. So we used the raw sports variable with the 5 categories. So we use kind of the original sports variable. We rescaled the variable so that 0 is never, 1 is less than monthly, and up to 60 is daily. We also measured the outcome variable later in 2013 instead of 2008. And we observed no change in the results. What we also did is we looked at different populations. So we looked at our younger age group and at the older age group, and we also did not observe a change in results. What we additionally did is that we added additional confounders. So we included lagged outcome and lagged treatment into our estimation, which led to that 1/3 of our sample was removed due to common support issues. I mean, it's not surprising that the common support issues would get bigger, but it didn't change the results, but it led to larger standard errors, which was not surprising. What we also did in a final step, we stratified at the median municipality size, and the median municipality size around 20,000. We did this because we thought that spending decisions might be undertaken differently in smaller compared to larger municipalities. But also for that kind of robustness checks, we did not observe any change in results. So with that, I'm going to come to the conclusion. I'm going to conclude, but also want to talk briefly about kind of the limitations as well as avenues for further research, given the results we observed in our paper. So first of all, that we find no evidence for local public expenditures on sports facilities impacting sports participation. The results are confirmed by various robustness checks we did. And which is also important is that our results are not due to noise, but we actually get a fairly precise 0. Yes, limitations and avenues for further research. So from a methods perspective, the methods we use is kind of subject to the standard limitations of the semi-parametric estimators, because we have a limited flexibility flexibility of the parametric propensity score. And we also do not have a systematic way of detecting heterogeneity. So it could be that we have subpopulations who gain by sport expenditures and who lose, and we can't really detect it the way we estimating we estimate. Yes. In addition, and this is a very big drawback, is the measurement of the sports variable in the G-sub. As I said, we only have information on the frequency of sports participation, and the frequency is also actually a very crude measure that is available in the G-sub. So we do not have information on time spent on exercising. We have no information on the intensity. And also we do not have any information on the type of sports. And this altogether is, of course, a big limitation of our study. Going over to the next slide, what we also do not have, we have no information on the level and the quality of existing sports facilities in 2001. So we might have some municipalities who have existing and up-to-date infrastructure in 2001, so kind of state-of-the-art infrastructure, and hence they do not have to invest in that period we actually observe. Because everything is state of the art. Could be a case, it's not completely likely in Germany, but it could be the case. And while others might need to catch up and hence invest a lot, we do not know that. We also do not know when the infrastructure will build. And yes, finally, we focus our analysis on adults. While it's beyond the scope of our paper to actually have a look at how the picture looks for children, it would be, of course, very interesting to study whether the picture looks very similar for children or completely different. But as I said, that's beyond the focus of our current paper. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Carina, for a very interesting talk and a very nice picture as well. Is that where you are now, or?
Yes, University of St Gallen. You see the Altstein in the back. Yeah.
Very clever.
Here's actually that's the gym you're looking at.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carina. We've got lots of time for Q&A, so if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, please raise your hand. Rob, you're on mute, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Carina. That was very clear and very interesting. Couple of points. The sports participation you're dealing with here is linked in your analysis to public sector provision. In the UK, the growth area has been largely, I think, private sector provision, private sector gyms, networks of leisure centres and such like. So I wonder if that is a phenomenon in Germany as well, in which case you're kind of understating the availability of facilities for sports participation, and also a possible dynamic where people who want to do some kind of sports can choose between a public sector facility and a private sector facility. I just wondered if sometimes public sector facilities emerge precisely because there is not a suitable private sector facility in that area. So I'm just wondering about the sort of interplay and dynamic between private and public sector provision. And I wonder if there's any data you would have that would kind of get hold of that. The second point is that there's a paper by some people at Zurich, Mark Breschow in Applied Economics, around about 2018-19, and they used number of sports facilities as an instrument for sports participation, where sports participation in turn was a potential determinant of health outcomes. Your analysis would seem to cast doubt on that because it wouldn't be a valid instrument if it holds over to other settings, which is maybe a bit pessimistic, I don't know. But I just wonder about your thoughts on that as well.
Thank you very much for your questions. To the second question, I thank you for Thank you so much for pointing out that paper to me. I'm actually going to look it up. I wasn't aware of that paper, but it's very interesting. So thanks a lot for pointing it out to me. And for the first question you asked, so we do not have local level information on private sports expenditures or infrastructure available. In the other paper we did in the project, and we did a simple correlation between the number of private fitness center on the state level and our expenditure measure, and it suggests that the provision of public and private sports infrastructure is not interrelated. That's kind of what we did on that level, but we do not know in our data we have kind of the private sports infrastructure within a community. And we also do not know, which on top of it, we do not know the distance for an individual based on his kind of geocode where he's living, how far he actually has to travel. So the information we have is really on this community level. So yeah, we can only make the correlation at the state level a bit in that way.
Great, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Carina. More questions and comments?
Maybe I can comment, James, briefly
Yep.
further on that issue, which is very important, I guess. So as Carina mentioned towards the end, it's very important to note that we were checking here basically if couch potatoes have an increased probability to do some sports after their municipalities where they are living in have increased their spendings, and as such eventually the quality of the facilities available. And there we do not find an effect. But in this accompanying paper, which was published in Labor Economics last year, where we were looking at the labor market effects, we find something. And this is highly suggestive of people who already do some sports might change somehow their frequency, eventually not too much, but their intensity, and eventually also the duration of sports, that they have at the end some benefits on health outcomes, for example, which in turn might be honored at the labor market because you are better in shape at the end. So we are a little bit kind of challenging whether this is really a policy instrument to get more people active, but it is not an answer to the question of whether already active people might be more active when they are living in such type of municipalities who spend a lot of money. And again, our second paper is suggestive that this is a case, but you should be just clear about in which direction you target your policy, right? And if it is about getting couch potatoes more active, or at least at all active, then eventually investing in the infrastructure is not the first best idea in this regard. So you need different measures, just to clarify.
Great, thanks, Tim. Matthew's got his hand up.
Hi, yeah, it's really just a sort of a comment. So the differences in municipalities were from, you've got 12,000 of them in Germany.
Yes.
Our data in England would be measured at the local authority level, so it's about 300. Because I'm actually looking at this with James at the moment. I just thought that was, so we're going to have to approach it quite differently, I think. But we do have the data on facilities because the government has, it publishes it almost weekly, a sort of update on the status of UK facilities. So, and we've then got whether they're privately owned or they're commercial enterprises. And actually that was something else that I was going to look at. But no, it's just, I just wanted to comment and say I thought it was a really interesting paper, and it's something that I think that James and I'll be exploring in the next sort of few months.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Oh, that's Matt. So I thought that was Matt. Another hand going up was still Matt's hand. Thank you, Matt. Yep. It's good to know actually that there is some information on the private and public question, because that was one that, you know, based on Rob's point, is something that we've thought a little bit about. Because obviously private gyms here in the UK everywhere. I shouldn't say everywhere, but they're very common now, and they've certainly been a feature of the recent changes in the urban landscape on the high streets in various places around the country. Any more questions and comments? Stefan.
Yeah, hi, Carina. Yes, very interesting paper and obviously a very important topic. I wanted to add something really which follows on a little bit from what Rob was saying and Tim's comment as well, which is, I think, in terms of thinking about this, maybe there's a sort of in the paper you could introduce a sort of a more theoretical discussion at the beginning about how you think public expenditures on health facilities might actually influence, have economic impacts in general. In some ways, the way you presented it sounded obviously like, good heavens, all this money is being wasted because it's not producing any effect. And Tim's point clarified that actually that's not quite what you're saying, right? But I was also wondering whether there are other mechanisms by which you might see impacts coming about. So obviously, and again, raises Rob's question about really the potential for substitution between private sector and public sector activities. And that's really, really important. And you mentioned the evaluation of local government spending at the beginning, and indeed, I mean, that's a very important point about local government spending, about whether there are substitution effects going on with the private sector. And my understanding is that in that literature there is quite a lot of impact evidence of substitution going on. The other thing I was going to sort of say is, you know, one of the other things you want to think about is outcomes in terms of participation. So you're framing this as, does this get people to participate? But surely part of this is, once I've done my physical exercise, what kind of shape am I in? You know, maybe I'm a better athlete if the local government is spending more money. So really, that's actually the payoff. And I was wondering if, and that maybe connects to Tim's point about labor markets, but also maybe you could do something, maybe look at where professional athletes come from in Germany. For example, you know, is it that where there's large local government spending, is that the places where all the star football players come from, or all the Olympic athletes come from, or is that really what's driving these differences, given the general level of interest? Because I think the other thing for all of us is, you know, Germany has so much more sports facilities than anybody else in the world, as far as I can see, right? I mean, you people are crazy, you know, sports fanatics. You know, and that's part of it. Again, you think about the level of infrastructure you have in Germany. This amount of spending by local governments in a 5-year period, relative to the sum of sports infrastructure in Germany, to me, it's just a drop in the ocean, right? That 5-year period, is it really? Well, maybe you can't pick anything up because it's actually just a tiny fraction of the total capital devoted to sports infrastructure in Germany.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. So it's a very good part, valuable comment that we include more about a theoretical discussion, maybe already in the introduction. So that's really helpful. And we thought about actually at one point, kind of going back to your comment on kind of the relationship between professional athletes, where they come from, and how this kind of interrelates with sports, local sports expenditures. We haven't done that yet. But thank you also very much for that comment. That's really very helpful. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Carina. Any more questions and comments? Okay, well, we'll take that as a no. But thank you again, Carina. That was a really interesting talk, really fascinating data set. obviously, as Matthew's pointed out, I've got an interest in it, given that we're doing something similar here in England as well. So it may well be that Matthew and I are in contact with you in the coming weeks and months, but look forward to also as your research professors as well. We will meet again next week for our 90th session, which will be Nicholas Scales from Manchester Metropolitan University. He's presenting on competitive balance and competitive intensity in European men's and women's football and intra-match analysis of the UEFA Euro. So please do join us as we go back to football, yeah, we look forward to that. So please do have a great weekend. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again this time next week.